right, so let's get this started. How y'all doing? Um, my name is Leron, and this talk is in the schedule. It's called "Y'all Trying to Understand Azure AD and RBAC and Nah," but I decided to change it um, simply because I think this title is more appropriate, and also because I'm giving this talk at another conference at another point in time, and I thought might as well just be consistent. So this talk is called "Y'all Trying to Enumerate Azure AD in ARM or Nah?" And we're going to talk about Azure AD. We'll talk about ARM, which is Azure Resource Manager, and uh, how the two services relate. So who am I? So my name is Leron, as I mentioned before. I am on the Azure Red Team at Microsoft. Notice some of the other Red Teamers had a presentation earlier from a different Red Team at Microsoft, and had to represent. I go by Daddy Coco Man, so if you see me in the chat or if you see my handle in a Slack somewhere, feel free to say hi or whatever. I have a website. You can check out my GitHub. I'm also a nerdcore rapper by the name of Oh My. You can check out my website. The SSL certificate expired, but who renews those? Nobody I know. And I was actually on the DEF CON tape this year. So if you happen to have the DEF CON tape, you can check that out. Check out one of my songs. Cool. Always got to promote my music. Check my SoundCloud. Check my Bandcamp. I was in the Navy for 10 years. I got out about 2 years ago, and I became a web app pen tester. And now here I am at Microsoft on the Azure Red Team. And I love Python and Pythonic things. So you'll constantly see me talk about Python on Twitter, or if you have any questions about how to get started or the things you can do or challenges you can do, hit me up and I'll hook you up with some stuff. So today we're going to talk about Azure Active Directory, Azure Resource Manager, tools for interacting with both of those. And I'll give a demonstration at the end of a tool that was written called Stormspotter, which allows you to visualize Azure AD and Azure Resource Manager and sort of find misconfigurations. Let's talk about AAD. So Azure Active Directory, or AAD, is a cloud-based identity and access management service. So you have all of these objects that are listed on the left, or you have users, groups, external identities. All these objects are within Azure Active Directory. So basically, it's like Active Directory, but in Azure. Wow, who'd have thunk it, right? It's a pretty clear-cut name, but it definitely has parallels to what you would find for Active Directory on a Windows domain. But because it's in the cloud, things are managed slightly differently, and you have a lot more options for the things you can do with these identities. So let's talk about these objects. We have users, which is your standard user, right? Someone who would log in. We have groups, which is a collection of objects. So it can be users, it can be groups, service principals, etc. Just other objects that are in Azure Active or AAD. We have applications, and applications are used to create service principal objects. We'll talk more about this later. This is pretty important. We have service principals, and a service principal is a local representation of an application instance within a tenant. And this will all be explained more as we go along. But then we also have devices, which are managed devices that you can add to Azure Active Directory. And we have roles. So a role is a set of permissions that is given to an AAD object. So it can be something like a global company administrator, a user account administrator, directory members. These are all the names of roles that you can apply to an Active Directory object, basically AAD object. Let's talk about users. They are a normal user. They can be internal or external. The way you can tell is because the internal will have the alias at the tenant and .onmicrosoft.com. An external will have an alias followed by an underscore, then the name of their home tenant, followed by Octothorpe. I'm using the fancy word, Octothorpe, ext Octothorpe, at tenant.onmicrosoft.com. So for example, you can have Leron.gray at stormspotter.onmicrosoft.com, or you can have Leron.gray underscore Microsoft.com Octothorpe, EXT Octothorpe at stormspotter.onmicrosoft.com. I've never said that word so many times in my life, and it just feels like really refreshing to use a new word. So if we look at what a user looks like in AAD, this is it. If you look in the portal, here we have Kelly Santana at stormspotter.onmicrosoft.com. And each object in Azure Active Directory is given an object ID. That's how it's referenced. So anytime you see an object ID, it's used to as a way for Azure Active Directory to know about that object and to provide relationships to other roles or permissions or other objects that are in Azure Active Directory. Then we have groups, which is pretty self-explanatory. A group is a group of objects. So you can have users, groups, devices, you can have service principals, and it's just a logical collection of groups. This is the same that you would have in a normal Active Directory environment where you have a group for membership. This applies the very same way. So we have direct members of a group, which are those who are explicitly assigned to a group. So in this instance, I forgot to put the actual name of the group here. The actual group is called sales. And under sales, we have Caroline, Catherine, Jason. We have another group called sales cashiers. So we have a nested group here. We have Kelly and Kyle. And if we look at all the members, right, we can see that it actually unrolls the other groups that are inside of this group and lists all the members of that group. So Johnny Anderson, Kristen Howell, and Dave Frank are all actually members of the sales cashiers group. But since we're looking at all the members of the sales group, they're going to show up here too. This is really important because sometimes, and a really common misconfiguration, is that you have groups that are part of other groups who accidentally inherit permissions that they're not supposed to have. So this is actually a fairly common thing that you can mess up in Azure Active Directory, the same way you could probably mess it up in Active Directory. So groups can also have owners, right? So you can have an owner of an object, but the owner doesn't have to be a member of that group. So in this case, we have this group called sales, and we have all these users and the sales cashiers group, but the owner is not only Kelly, but also a service principal called Sales AED SPN. Why is that there? I don't know. That's probably a misconfiguration. There's no reason, well, there's not really a reason. There's not a common reason to have a service principal in charge, have ownership over a group, but that's definitely something you can look into if you were to see that. I'd question it myself. So what applications? So an application is a template used to create a service principal for authentication. So basically, an application is like you make a website, right? I don't know, stormspotter.azurewebsites.net, and you create this application inside of Azure, and then you give it an AD application, and you say this application is responsible for authorizing you to access stormspotter.azurewebsites.net. So you can set up a website or whatever and have the AD authentication automatically done through the use of this AD application object. So applications can be single tenant or multi-tenant. What this means is that you can have an application that's made specifically for your own company, your own organization, or you can have an application that's meant for anyone. And when you create a multi-tenant app, that really means multi-tenant. That means that any organization has access to that application. There's been a recent history over the last couple of years of attackers making malicious applications, multi-tenant applications, which then create a service principal and the target tenant, and then all of a sudden they have some sort of permission and a tenant that they're not supposed to have because maybe the administrators forgot to turn off the ability for users to add applications to the tenant. So it's something that you definitely want to be careful of when you're talking about applications, because a application with too many permissions that is not yours, or even if it is yours, can be pretty troublesome. So here's what an application looks like in the portal. It has an application ID and it has an object ID. So remember, the object ID is what Azure Active Directory uses to reference it, but the application ID is the application that is unique to this, or is the ID that's unique to this application. Because again, we can have multiple, you can have a multi-tenant application with different service principals, right, in different tenants, but they're all going to point to this one application ID. So we talk about service principals, right? It's an instance of an AD application that's somewhere out there, right? Whether it's in your tenant or somebody else's. The credentials that you can add credentials to service principal and you can use it to log in as that particular identity. It's usually used, think of it like a service account, right? You don't need a user to log in to do this action, or maybe you have some sort of automation set up. You use a service principal to do that. You can add a password to it, or you can add a certificate to it for authentication. And if you create a service principal directly, it'll also create an application behind it automatically. So even if you don't create the application yourself, creating a service principal directly will create that application because it needs to be tied to some application, some sort of application ID. So here's what I mentioned before. We have the application, and it has that application ID on the left side. And on the right side, we have the service principal that represents that application inside of this tenant. And the application ID for the two are the same, but the object ID for the two are different because they're two different objects as far as Azure Active Directory is concerned. Talk about devices. Devices are can be joined or registered. You typically find joined devices for corporate resources, right? So you have like a desktop or some managed device by your organization, and you would join that to AAD. Or you can have a registered device, and those registered ones are usually bring your own device. So they're like a mobile device that maybe an employee has a phone and they've allowed you to manage, or they've enrolled it so that they can access corporate resources, and they're not really joined because it's their own personal device, but they are registered. So here's an example. The first one in this list is an Azure AD joined Windows host, and the other ones are all registered, right? They're not managed uh, by the Active Directory, but it allows me to access some of the resources because I'm known to Azure Active Directory. Let's talk about roles. So roles define permissions for other AAD objects. They have a built-in. There are built-in roles. You can make your own, but they have a predefined set of permissions. Right? So you can make your own, but you should definitely check your permissions that you add to them. There's a lot of very granular AAD roles already. If you need to make one, feel free to go ahead, but you want to make sure that your roles aren't too permissive, and you should probably check to see if it's already covered by a built-in role, just so you don't mess something up. It's like rolling your own crypto, right? There's already crypto there, right? Don't try to roll your own if it exists already. Here's what it would look like in Portal. So if you look at the list of AAD roles, you'll have all these lists, and they all end with administrator for the most part, or with exceptions things like global reader. But most of these roles are administrative roles because they have some sort of power over another AAD object. The one that I have highlighted here is global administrator, which can manage all aspects of Azure AD and Microsoft services. That is the top almost the top administrator. You can actually elevate from that into another role, but global administrators are the accounts that you definitely 100% want to protect through MFA, and perhaps a separate account from the different user account, the same way that you would treat a domain administrator. So you don't use your regular account to do domain administrator work, I hope. You have a separate account that you would log into in order to do that level of activity. Some of the other ones that are highlighted here are, I mean, all these administrative roles are interesting, but some of the other highlighted ones are, for example, the help desk administrator, which can reset passwords for non-administrators and help desk administrators, which basically gives you the ability to reset any user's password and then log in as them, assuming like there's no like MFA involved or anything like that. So you should definitely look through these roles, see uh, if if there's something that you may want to use and apply to a particular set of objects before you try to create your own groups or your own roles. Excuse me. Here's what it looks like. If you look at a summary, if you look in Portal, you'll get a summary of the role, it'll give you a description. But more importantly, these roles are a set of permissions. So each permission has a namespace, an object in the namespace, and sometimes some properties, and an action that you can do on that object. You can look at the site there, and you can just Bing. I'm gonna say Bing as we talk about Microsoft today, right? If you decided to Bing directory assignment admin roles, you can check that out. So the role permissions look like this, right? They have Microsoft directory, which is the namespace. Then you have these users objects, and as a help desk administrator, I can invalidate all their refresh tokens. That would be the first one in that list, right? And all these permissions are laid out so you know exactly what each role is able to do. Let's talk about Azure Resource Manager. Oh, one thing I didn't cover, and I realized this morning, and I didn't put it in the slides because I really didn't have time, were managed identities. Um, a managed identity is an identity that you can give to a resource in Azure, like a virtual machine or something like that. You can give that a managed identity so that you can access other resources. Those managed identities will show up in Azure Active Directory, so you can treat it just like an actual identity for that resource. But anyway, so let's move on to Azure Resource Manager. So it is the deployment and management service for Azure resources sources. It used to be called ASM, Azure Service Manager, way back when. I don't know how long back when, before I joined Microsoft at least. Um, and it's now known as Classic. So if you see something like Classic Administrator or Classic Storage or Classic Resource, they're talking about services that were provisioned under Azure Service Manager. The Azure Resource Manager is essentially a set of APIs that are used to talk to all of the resource providers within Azure. So you can access it through Portal, through PowerShell, through the Azure CLI, or through just a REST client, right? You can talk to it directly with curl or whatever API talking tool you like to use. And you can talk to uh, the resource providers that are in Azure. So here's some terminology you need to know. There's the tenant, which is the representation of an organization. So when you log in, so for example, Microsoft.com or Microsoft would be a tenant, right? But Microsoft as an organization may have other sub-organizations. So you can have an organization for Microsoft Part 1, a different tenant for Microsoft Part 2, Microsoft Part 3, and just know that a tenant represents an organization as it's defined by however your organization wants to define its organizations. There's no set way, but usually you have the top level tenant, and then you may have other tenants that are alongside that are provisioned by an organization. You have subscriptions, which is a logical collection of resource groups, and they're usually separated for billing purposes. So you can have a subscription maybe for your sales department, one for your IT department. That's how you should do it, particularly when you're talking about like billing, so you know who's using what resources, and if there's different funding levels, right, you can manage it that way. If you have a resource group, which is just a collection of resources, you have a resource. And a resource is any manageable item in Azure. That includes virtual machines, web apps, storage, key vaults, anything you can manage, which means that subscriptions and resource groups are also considered resources because you can manage those directly because they come from what's called a resource provider. So a resource provider is a service that provides a type of resource. Wow, right? So for a storage account, you would have Microsoft.storage for the resource provider. For subscription, you would have Microsoft.subscription. You have Microsoft.compute for like virtual machines and other compute resources that you can provision within the portal. And then finally, we have this concept of role-based access controls. And role-based access controls are a set of permissions that a user may take on a resource. The resource is defined in scope, and also these are not the same as AAD roles. So keep in mind that AAD and ARM are separate. They're not, they can correlate information, but their identities and services are separate. Right? AAD manages your identities while ARM manages your resources. So here's a list of resource providers. I talked about this in the last slide, really. And if you look at them, there's one resource provider for almost every, for literally every resource that you can have in Azure. Sometimes you may see these service principals pop up under your in your AAD, and it's because when you provision a resource, right, Azure needs to know, Azure needs to provide the service principal for that application so that it can provision those resources within your organization. So before we talked about how applications have a service principal, no, service principal for representation in a local tenant. That's what that is. So you'll see these around depending on what type of resources you have in your environment. Let's talk about the control plane versus the data plane. It's also very important. Operations in ARM are divided into two categories. One is control or management, as you may hear it called, and the other is the data plane. So the control plane is for managing the resource within Azure Resource Management or ARM. Requests for these for the control plane are sent to the resource provider, right? So Microsoft.storage, if I want to add a new storage account, for example. But the data plane is for managing the operations of the resource. So if I have something like a virtual machine, I can create and delete a virtual machine on the control plane or the management plane, but I have the RDP on the data plane, right? If I can create a storage account on the control plane, but if I want to read and write data to the storage account, I need to have permissions on the data plane, right? It's a very important concept for understanding role-based access control, because these are two different sets of permissions that can affect what is essentially the same resource and then the instance of that resource. So the role-based access control is the authorization system that was built on top of ARM that allows you to access or at least control or manage your access to resources. An RBAC role is based on three parts. You have the security principal, which is an AD object, so a user group, a service principal, managed identity, etc. You have a role definition, which is the collection of permissions. And then we have the scope that it applies to. So you have, again, you have the object that you are giving the permissions to, you have the permissions that you are giving to that object, and then you have what scope that those permissions are going to be valid for. So here's some general RBAC roles you'll hear about. Contributor, owner, and reader are three very common roles and pretty generic roles. Owner being, as far as a resource goes, one of the most powerful, not the most powerful, but pretty high up there on managing that resource, because it gives you access to manage all of it. And then you have contributor, which is a next level down, because it grants you access to manage the resources, but it doesn't allow you to add additional RBAC roles. And then you have reader, right? Reader just allows you to view the resources, but you can't make any changes at all. Right? And then you also have the specific RBAC roles. So in this list right here, we have the ability to, you have contributor on an SMB share, which is in storage, and it's very specific, right? This role gives you only the ability to read, write, and delete access on files and directories in Azure file shares. Like that's very specific. And so when you start giving out your permissions in Azure AD, you want to make sure that you're trying to give that least privilege concept, right? You don't need to give someone contributor over the entire resource group or the entire resource itself. You can give a very specific part of that resource. You can give access to a very specific part of that resource if you wanted to. So role definitions affect both management and data planes. And the way it's organized is that here is a role called the storage blob data reader, right? You have these management actions and you have these not actions. So on the management plane, right, I can read the containers that are in a storage account. I can also generate keys, but focusing right now on this being able to read the container. And then you have on the data plane the ability to read the blobs within the container. So these are two different permissions. You can have access to the storage account itself, but if you don't have permissions to read the blobs, then you won't be able to read the blobs. Again, the management access is not inherent to that data for that specific reason I just mentioned. I'm actually getting ahead of myself. So yeah, the permissions to read the container in a storage account does not give you permissions to read the blobs. The way not actions work is that you get a list of actions that you can do, and sometimes these actions will have like an asterisk, for example. So maybe instead of Microsoft.storage/storage accounts, I have Microsoft.storage/asterisk. And what that means is that all the resources under Microsoft.storage resource provider, I have this level of access to. What the way not actions works is that it subtracts the roles that you have in your actions, and it says, well, if that was an asterisk, maybe I don't want you to read storage accounts, so you can put a not action in that field. But not actions, I learned just recently, a couple of days ago, was that not actions are not don't have any precedence over the actions. So if you have um, an action that is covered, and then you have that not action, and they both reference the same permission, you will have access to that permission simply because it's in the actions. So not actions is not it is not like a higher priority. It's just an easier way to manage what your permissions are. Yeah, that's a lot. I had to read up on that a couple of days ago, and I did not know that. So I learned something new. Someone on the Azure Red Team, right? Um, so here are the actions, permissions, and operations. Um, you you have these list of operations that you can do on the left. So maybe get blob metadata, and here are the permissions that are required to perform that action. So if I want to snapshot a blob, which means just sort of like a version history thing, then I need to have the ability to write blobs, or I need to have the ability to add /action on blobs. And this can get pretty uh, confusing at times because sometimes actions don't always don't clearly represent what permissions that they have. So this happened a few days ago, and I decided to put this one in. But someone asked me on Slack, they were like, "Hey, I have this permission for storage queue data reader, and I'm trying to read the messages that are in my queue, but it won't work." And I thought that was pretty interesting, so I looked into it, and the permissions that it gives you, that this role gives you, is the ability to read messages, right? So you can peek or retrieve. It says retrieve, but you can peek one of the messages from a queue. But the way queues work is that when you read a message, it also pops the message off the queue, right? Just like any other queue, which means that if you want to get a message, you also need to have the ability to delete that message from the queue. So it's two explicit permissions, one for reading and one for deleting. If you don't have the delete permission, then you can't actually get the message. You can just look at the message and leave it there. So here are the actions for the storage queue data reader, which is what this person tried to apply to their user. But what they really wanted was a storage queue data message processor, which gives you the read permission, but it also gives you the process/action permission, which satisfies the requirements in order to get messages. So it's a matter of understanding what the permissions are that what action you're trying to take on the type of resource that you're trying to take. Getting a message, getting a queue message just sounds like you're reading it, but really you also have to delete it, so you need that delete permission as well. I'm going to speed up here because yeah. So here's an example of applying an RBAC role to to an object, right? Or just applying RBAC, excuse me, a role assignment. Here's an example of a role assignment. Wow. So you have these AD objects that are part of the marketing group, and the marketing group is assigned contributor access to a scope, which is the pharma sales resource group. So the marketing group now has full access to all resources in the pharma sales resource group, but they can't assign additional RBAC roles to that group to other people. Let's talk about interacting with AD and ARM. The most common way that you do it is through the portal. You log into portal.azure.com. Depending on the cloud environment that you're in, if you are working in the US government world, it might be portal.azure.us for Germany, China. They all have their different URLs that they would use to access the portal, but it all essentially looks the same. Microsoft tries to aim for parity against all cloud environments. So you'll find that it generally looks the same. You have the Azure CLI. It's written in Python, which means that when you install Azure CLI, you're also installing Python on your system. That's just a note for anybody who does like any sort of risk assessment or whatever. Because it's written in Python, there's actually an instance of Python that gets installed with the Azure CLI. So if you're worried about like being able to know what all your users are doing, because like you have like script block logging on PowerShell, something like that, and you're trying to lock down a host, the Azure CLI is actually something you may want to look at to see if it's installed, because it doesn't really explicitly explain that it's installing Python, but it does. And the way you would log in with the Azure CLI is with the AZ login command. When you do this and you log in, your access tokens that are used to talk to these endpoints, they're just JWT. I forgot what JWT stands for, but those tokens, yeah, they get saved in your .azure folder under access tokens.json. So here's an example, right? I can list the key vaults in this the subscription that I've logged into. I can interact with the Azure Active Directory by listing the user. So here I'm listing Kelly Santana, and I can see the properties that are attached to that user. PowerShell, there's a lot of PowerShell modules for Azure. AZ PowerShell is the newest version for interacting with Azure. This is the one you should probably be using. If you're not, you should try to get there. It can't exist with the Azure RM module. And the way you will log in is with connect.az account. The Azure RM module is the older version of the AZ PowerShell module for interacting with Azure. The module names all have like Azure RM in them, the same way that the AZ PowerShell accounts have connect-az something or whatever. But it can't exist with the AZ PowerShell module. So you may have some older scripts that use Azure RM. You may want to upgrade those to AZ PowerShell. Then you have the Azure AD module, which is for interacting with Azure Active Directory. The current versions work with Microsoft Graph. This is fairly recent because previously it did not. And it also works in PowerShell core. Before Azure AD was working with Microsoft Graph, there was another one called MS Online. So if you see this, I think I saw like some blog posts recently this year that was using MS Online, and I was like, okay, sure. But you can use the Azure AD one instead. And it also does not work in PowerShell core. So if you're running it from like Linux or something like that, or WSL, you won't have any luck with that. And then there's the Azure PowerShell module, which sounds like what you may want to interact with Azure, but it's not, unless you have classic resources in your Azure tenant, right? It's explicitly used for that. Some organizations still have those types of resources, or they have those classic management certificates that they use to manage their Azure, what was Azure Service Manager. So you want to use the Azure PowerShell module for that. So again, there are 5 of them, but the 2 that you really want are AZ PowerShell and Azure AD if you're using if you decide to interact with PowerShell. Then you have the Azure SDKs. They come in a bunch of different languages. They're broken up into management libraries and the data plane libraries, so you can interact with the management plane or the data plane as was described before earlier in the talk. There's been a lot of refactoring for these libraries, particularly for the Python libraries. They've changed a lot this year. They've gotten a lot better. They were kind of messy before, but everything is definitely a lot more streamlined now. So, but if you're updating your libraries from an older tool, you should definitely test before you update and implement a new library, because a lot of things have changed, particularly around managing different identities for logging in with these SDKs. You can check that out at azure.github.io/azure-SDK, and you'll see all the languages, and you'll see the client and management libraries that come for that language. And then if you really want to, you can use the REST APIs. There's a lot of those. I'm not gonna go into them, but the documentation is there. It allows you to talk to any resource or a graph or whatever. You can just look through the documentation if you're really curious about using these things directly. So let's talk about Stormspotter. So Stormspotter is a tool that the Azure Red Team has presented this year publicly, and it is used to create an attack graph of Azure AD and Azure Resource Manager. We use the term attack graph because we are a red team, but realistically, you can use it to just sort of look at and audit your own tenant based on the types of resources that you have. It's backed by Neo4j, which means that we'll be using some Cypher query language. It's written primarily in Python for the back end, and the front end was written in Vue. Look, I know there's software engineer in my title, but I am trash when it comes to a lot of actual developing, like professionally, right? So if you happen to look at Stormspotter and you see how messy this Vue.js front end is, whoops. All right, so it enables red teams and pen testers to visualize the attack surface and pivot opportunities within a tenant. And I mentioned, again, it can be used by defenders to audit themselves. One thing to note, though, this is not an official Microsoft project. It's just a tool that we wrote as a red team. When we released this, I saw articles come out about like Microsoft releases Azure Stormspotter, and I'm kind of like, there's no Azure in the name. I guess it's like a whole like legality thing that comes with putting Azure in the name, but it's just called Stormspotter. And it's still in beta, so it works, but it does not work as well as it could be. There's still a long way to go for getting it on point. So why does it exist? So we want to use it to understand the configuration of the environment. Understanding that should be effects, not affect. Wow, grammar. So no, actually, never mind. Never mind. Whoops. So yeah, you want to understand the security of the environment, and relationships are easy to understand when they're visualized, right? We have tools like Bloodhound, which are used for Active Directory enumeration, that have been proven to work, right? It gives everyone a better display of how these how relationships work within Active Directory. So we want to provide that sort of similar concept within Azure for AAD and ARM. So would you rather look at this text output, right? If I want to see the owner of a service principal, right, who happens to be Kelly Santana, would you rather look at this output, or would you rather look at this nice graph that says that Kelly Santana owns this web application or AAD application, and this application is represented by the sales AAD SPN within the environment? Personally, I know I'd rather look at the second. So we're going to demonstrate that real quick. The requirements for using Stormspotter, though, for AAD, you must have read access to either Azure AD or Microsoft Graph. So the reason why Azure AD is listed here as legacy is because it's considered to be a legacy permission, right? Azure AD is still the name of the service, but the permission itself is considered legacy. because it falls under graph.windows.net, and Microsoft is trying to move everyone to graph.microsoft.com. However, for Stormspotter purposes, we try to access Azure AD graph.windows.net first, because there's a little more information in there that hasn't yet been filled into MS Graph. But eventually, graph.windows.net, I think, may go away. I'm not sure. But they're definitely trying to move everyone into graph.microsoft.com. I think back in July, they stopped. They said that they're no longer going to add any new features and are really pushing people towards the new service. For Azure Resource Manager, you must have reader access to at least a subscription level. And that's because enumeration of the resources happens at the subscription level based on the way that IDs are structured. I didn't talk about this, but the way that I'll show it to you in a bit. The way that Azure Resource Manager IDs for a resource is structured is usually like subscription slash the subscription ID slash resource groups slash the name of the resource group slash the type of resource provider slash the resource, and it's pretty wild. But enumeration for these client libraries happens at the subscription level. Currently, only Azure CLI and Service Principal logins are supported. So I'm going to show you this demo. Here we go. All right. So I've actually already logged in as Kelly Santana. I can show you this by listing the account here. I've already logged in as Kelly Santana. We'll just say that I've somehow found Kelly's credentials on Twitter or something. Whoops, took a picture, accidentally posted a password on a sticky note or something. However, I got the credentials. I've logged in as Kelly. And I kind of want to see with Stormspotter what Kelly has access to. So you could use the AZ CLI, you can use PowerShell to do all this sort of enumeration. There are some other tools that people have written this year to view what Azure resources that people have. But we're just going to do this with Stormspotter. So let's see, directly am I in? So I'm going to run the collector tool as soon as I remember what, because I was definitely in the wrong folder. And if I look at this, it's just a Python zip file, and I can work through my way uh, through the help options just as you would any other tool. I'm not really going to explain any of this now, but the most important thing that you can take from this, what's on the screen right now, is that you can specify whether or not you want to just scan Azure or scan AD. You can also specify the subs that you want to scan if you want to specify, if you want to be specific. So I'm going to run this tool. I've already logged in via the CLI, so I can just use the CLI authentication. First thing that happens is I authenticate successfully. I start enumeration. Start enumeration for Azure Resource Manager, and all this is happening at the same time. So there's like thousands of requests going out, depending on how large your organization is. Start enumerating Azure AD. Started all the queries for each type that is currently supported by Stormspotter. Then I also started enumerating the subscriptions as well. They found one subscription. It tried to enumerate the management certs, which is a classic resource, but I didn't. Not only do I not have management certs, but I also don't have permissions as Kelly Santana. So it just lets you know this is fine. If you see this warning, that's a good thing. If you don't see this warning, that is something to look into for sure. So it finishes all the querying, and this happened to me yesterday, and I didn't realize what caused this. I had actually signed up for the Azure security free tier, and this is telling me that there are some resources that Kelly cannot access. Kelly knows that they're there, but can't actually access the resource in order to enumerate it. So these warnings are fine. it prints out these things that tell you that you can't access this resource. And then it prints out, it zips up the output and it puts it in this file. So I'm going to open this real quick. This was the most recent one. And it's a bunch of SQLite files. So if I open up one, for example, for users, I can actually look at the data in the SQLite file. The way it's the way it's organized is that it's just a JSON output in the file because it was the easiest in the column because it's just the easiest way to handle all these different object types as opposed to putting each property into an individual column. But I really don't care so much for querying this data directly, although you could, right? It is SQL, so you could query it that way. I am going to start up Stormspotter with Docker. I'm just going to build it real quick. And this actually doesn't take very long at all because I've already built it. So there's the front end starting up. Here's the back end starting up. Waiting for Neo4j, which cool. So we can go there. And I'm going to visit the Stormspotter page. So here's the login screen. The default password is, of course, password, because why not? And I've logged in, and already I have no results because I haven't uploaded anything. Make this slightly bigger. Here we go. All right, so we'll upload the file that we just got from the Stormspotter collection. There's no indication currently on the front end that it's finished, but as it's going through, it starts enumerating all these different node types in the from the database. If I wanted to see if it was finished, I would look at the backend logs. Eventually, I will find a way to show it on the front end. What ended up happening was I happened to have like a 10 gigabyte file one time when I was testing this, and it was just it became so unwieldy and took so long that uh, showing it that progress on the front end was a design choice that I haven't fully decided on yet. So finish the ingestion so we can start looking at things. The first thing I want to know is who are my global administrators, right? So if I go over here to this queries tab, there's some preset queries in here. And I want to know who my global administrators are. And here we get this nice little graph. We're going to ignore Greg real quick. We'll ignore myself, ignore these three. These are the two that I really care about. Because these are the members of in the Stormspotter tenant. So we have this account called Chalk Olate, and we have this account called Global. And Global has this administrator account name. So when I click on an object, I can see the properties of this object on the right side. There are some properties that aren't shown here. And if I wanted to see that directly, I can click on the raw data. This is supposed to be JSON indented, but I haven't figured out why it doesn't work yet. So I've been struggling on that one for days. But I just blame it on JavaScript. So I can see all the properties and I can see the relationships. So here I have Global and Chalk Olate, who are both members of the company administrator. Right, that makes them targets in my eyes. Right? If I were someone who had stolen Kelly Santana's um, identity. But in order to see what Kelly has access to, we're going to look her up real quick. Where a name was Kelly Santana. And here's Kelly's node or ID. So we can click on expand outgoing, which shows which relationships have or which nodes have a relation from Kelly to that node. And we see that Kelly has a couple of interesting things, right? Kelly owns the sales cashier group. She owns the service principal, the application that we talked about earlier. She owns the sales group, and she's a member of the sales. So Kelly is probably like a sales manager or something like that. She is a contributor to a subscription, which that is probably a bug, because that subscription is right here. So I have to figure out why that showed up. She's a contributor to a subscription, and this is probably the most interesting thing because for some reason Kelly has contributor level access to this subscription. So I want to see what's in this subscription. I'm going to change the way the graph looks just to make it easier. So in the subscription, we have a bunch of different resource groups. And we noticed that Glow was Global was a global administrator earlier. And here's a resource group called Glow. So I want to know what's in here. What does Kelly from sales, uh, what permissions does she have on Glow's resource group? And although this gets a little messy, so let's filter this down and expand it and change how that looks, right? So the Glow resource group has a key vault. It has a public-facing IP that is likely attached to this virtual machine, and there's a disk here as well. So if I start expanding on this virtual machine, uh, it gets to be a lot actually, but I can see that this virtual machine has RDP open on 3389. So now I have an IP address. I have an IP address. I have I have RDP access, and as a contributor, I would be able to log in to this IP address. I'm going to, and I'm running out of time, but I'm going to show you how this can be used real quick. So um, since I have contributor level access on that virtual machine, right, by transitive by misconfiguration, I can actually, let's see, oops, sorry about that. A VM user update. I can update the administrator, uh, update the virtual machine with an administrator, my own administrator and password. So I can do, I like being admin. The name of the resource group was Glow. The username, we'll call it temp admin. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna go up in my history real quick because I actually already had this set up somewhere and I didn't copy and paste it. Anyway, and then I'll give it a password. Test password one bang. And what this does is it creates a user on this virtual machine, which I shouldn't have, which Kelly shouldn't have access to because it's not in sales or anything like that. It's a misconfiguration. So Kelly has access to this virtual machine. Let's set up a username, a temp admin with the password, and then I can RDP into this virtual machine that Glow uses, and I can look around and see what is on Glow's virtual machine. Um, it's it's uh, it's very important to understand what these permissions do. I'm gonna let this finish, but since I'm running out of time, I'm actually gonna finish up the slides real quick. Although I kind of just want to let you see that it succeeds in me being able to um, uh, change the username and password. You notice that I did give you an IP address and I gave you a username and I gave you a password, but you actually won't be able to log into this because I have some permissions set up explicitly for me. So don't do that. Uh, so just to close this out real quick, AAD ARM permissions can be pretty complex. You should check your audit. You should regularly audit your permissions to check for changes, and follow the least privilege rules. So you don't need access to an entire subscription or resource group just to access a resource. And users who manage resources should only be given access to the resources that they need. So yeah, if you have any questions, you can hit me up at MCOHMI. It's MCOMI. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, whatever, wherever you want to hit me up at. You can hit me up on my email, which is daddycocoman@gmail.com, or you can add me on LinkedIn. If you add me on LinkedIn, just put in Bsides Seattle so that I know where you came from. And that is my time. So I will take questions in the Discord because the next talker is going to come up, right, Carrie?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Leron.